And joining us now with further insight on the initiative is Nori's Chief Development Officer, Christophe Jospe. Thank you so much for joining us. Let's start with what a carbon credit is and how this market works. It's complicated, but I know you can explain it to us in layman's terms.
Sure. Thanks for having me on. I love talking in layman's terms. So we try to avoid using the word credit, but we recognize that other people do, and we call it an asset. But it's essentially a representation of an environmental activity. And for Nori, it represents 1 ton of carbon dioxide taken out of the atmosphere and stored in the soils.
Okay. Now, I remember from economics, tradable emissions rights. Talk about how this ties into that and how the actual market will work.
Sure. So when I think about environmental commodities, I like to describe them as different types of fruit. And you have fruit that can represent an avoided emission, and you have fruit that can represent an emission that didn't actually go out there in the first place, like an emission reduction or a renewable energy certificate. But there's also the removal, which is taking carbon out of the atmosphere. And so what we are helping people generate is a consumable commodity that can only be sold and traded once that represents 1 ton of CO2 taken out of the atmosphere, so that buyers who are large companies, individuals, or even governments who have emission target obligations can use carbon removal to meet those targets.
Okay, let me just make sure I'm understanding this correctly. If you are not putting as much CO2 into the atmosphere, you can actually sell the credits of the CO2 that you are not polluting. Is that correct?
That's correct, but that's not what we're doing.
Okay.
But those are carbon credits. And that's actually part of the problem, is that it's really confusing. And we don't think it needs to be. We think it should be as simple as thinking of it as like a virtual garbage collection service. If you're producing garbage, well, someone should be there to take that garbage away. And we're not saying you need to live in a garbage-less society. We're just saying if you think of CO2 as garbage, well, then you can start figuring out ways to not put that garbage in the street, or if you need to pay for someone to remove it, that's where Nori comes in.
Okay, it's so exciting what you're doing. Really, please keep in touch with us. Let us know all the developments. Nori's Chief Development Officer, Christophe Jospe, thank you so much for joining us.